Hey there, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to Retro Unscripted once again. This is episode 9. This is our third week on the air, and I am honored and happy that you've decided to join us today. In this episode, I'm going to take you back. Take you back to 1991. At that time, I was 19 years of age. I had gone from going to college and living with my grandmother to dropping out of school and working as a long-distance operator for AT&T in Worcester, Massachusetts. I was living with a pair of roommates at the time, and for the first time in my life, really up to that point, I actually had money to spend because I was earning it. It wasn't something that I was having given to me or that I had to ask for. It was something that I could spend pretty much at will as long as I paid my bills. So, when the Super Nintendo Entertainment System came out in the late summer, early fall period of 1991, myself and a few friends, all of us went to the Toys R Us in Auburn, Massachusetts to pick up our Super Nintendos. Um, the games that we bought varied. A couple of friends bought Super Bases Loaded, for example. Another couple bought F-Zero. Myself, the games that I had at launch, aside from Super Mario World, which is still fantastic, ActRaiser, which is a great game in its own right, and one I'll probably revisit, I should say, in a later episode. And then, yes, you can see Final Fantasy IV behind me. This is the Super Nintendo version right here, Final Fantasy II. Interesting thing about Final Fantasy II is that it's the first RPG that I had ever played. I know that there were RPGs that came out before then on the NES, and I chose to pass them by. Games like Dragon Warrior, or like Final Fantasy, or Faxanadu. These are games that I just couldn't identify with at that particular time in my life. You see, arcade games were pretty much the dominant force in my gaming life and my gaming habit at that time. I played games for 5, 6, 10, 20 minutes at a time until I either registered a high score or lost all my lives, and then that was it. It was a fun game. I would move on to something else, which is probably where my gamer ADD comes from. But with Final Fantasy II and with Final Fantasy and Dragon Warrior, these involve a much larger investment of your time. These are things you can't really complete in one sitting unless you have a lot of free time. They're also story driven. You're learning about characters and their backstories and this overarching story that links everything together. Very often it's about saving the world or something epic like that. And Final Fantasy II was my first foray into that kind of game. Now, I wasn't going to buy Final Fantasy II at first. I can actually thank Nintendo Power for turning me on to it. Nintendo Power had written some really nice things about it and showed some maps and talked about kind of how it was like a movie, and I was intrigued by that. I said, why not? So I ponied up my money for that game and for ActRaiser along with the Super Nintendo, and I went home. And Final Fantasy II was the last of the 3 games that I had tried out. And I'm foolish for waiting, because Final Fantasy II affected how I would play games for the next 13 years or so. Final Fantasy II drove me to play anytime I had free time. When I wasn't working, I would be at home in my bedroom with the door shut and playing that game. Friends would ask where I was going or what I was doing. My roommates were concerned about me. But it was okay. I had to find out what else was going on in the story. Where Cecil and his party would go next. Who would be revolving in and out of the party? What happens to the characters? These are all things that continued to keep me playing and to keep drawing me back, even though there were other things that I probably could have been doing or should have been doing, and other games that I had bought, they were just sitting idly by. I was so focused and entrenched on this game and trying to see the end of the story that it captivated me in a way that a game really hadn't done to that point. aside from the story, there is also the hook of earning experience and being able to level up your characters and see how they improve. Um, Rosa and Rydia and Tella and even Cecil at one point in the game earn spells based on experience and how many times you level up, what your level is. So that drove me to fight monsters a little bit. I also learned about grinding, although it was kind of late. Now, had I had Mystic Quest at that time, of course it didn't exist yet, but had I had that and understood why grinding was important, why saving at every particular location was important, about what hit points were, about what magic points were, I might have had a little bit easier time with Final Fantasy II. As it was, I was kind of learning on the fly, and the instruction manual only got you so far. As a matter of fact, one of the bonuses of working for the phone company was that we could make free long distance phone calls from the call center. So I actually called Nintendo's hotline, 206 885 7529, for those that don't remember. I actually called that quite a bit, asking questions about Final Fantasy II, how to get certain treasure chests, or about strategies for certain bosses that I couldn't figure out on my own, or that they kept kicking my butt. And one of the things that I kind of learned through experience was that you have to fight monsters. You can't keep running away. You need to be able to earn that experience to raise your level enough to be a decent challenge for the bosses, rather than bosses running all over your character party. In subsequent playthroughs of Final Fantasy 2/4, I've probably played through the game about 10 times. You learn and you take the time to grind whenever you possibly can and get your character level up, so that monster battles are pretty much a breeze. But I learned about that. I learned about spell casting, about strategy, who should be in the front, who should be in the back. Learned about protecting yourself from spells, casting wall spells. I mean, just a ton of lessons that I learned in this game that I had been able to take with me to later RPGs as I bought them in the years that went by. And the funny thing about Final Fantasy II to me is that when I finally did crack this nut, when I finally beat the game, and I finally put Zeramis down, it was 2, 3 in the morning. I started jumping around my room and pumping my fist and shouting "yeah!" and my rather angry roommates came skulking downstairs and opened my door. What the hell are you doing? And I pointed to the ending sequence, and I said, I finally did it. And I watched the story wrap up. I found out what happened to all of the characters, and that was an accomplishment. It was an achievement, and it was something that I'm still proud of to this day. And of course, the game itself opened me up to RPGs and wanting to play them, and understanding that time sink and required time investment isn't really so bad, especially if the story kind of carries you along. And of course, from there, I went on to from Final Fantasy II, I went on to pre-order Final Fantasy III Sight Unseen, and I bought that on launch day. As a matter of fact, I took time off of work to play that. Chrono Trigger was huge. Final Fantasy VII, oh my goodness, Final Fantasy VII, I also took time off of work for that. And I, just like I did with the PlayStation, I crossed days off on the calendar until the game came out, and that's all I would play, was that game. Even though after the first disc I kind of lost interest, but that's a story for another time. Final Fantasy VIII wasn't my thing. I know it's probably one of the more divisive RPGs on the planet, but it wasn't really for me. I liked Final Fantasy IX and the throwback feel. 10 is, to me, I had a lot of fun with 10. And then after that, I started to lose interest. 11 was an MMO, which I don't care about. 12, the battle system went away from the turn-based stuff that I enjoyed to something else, which I didn't understand. I've tried to play Final Fantasy 12 at least 6 times, starting over from the very beginning, and I still don't understand it. And then Final Fantasy 13, which I'll let anyone else tell you about. I don't like talking about that game. It still leaves a bad taste in my mouth. But for years, from 1991 all the way up until, say, 2001, 2002, if it wasn't for Final Fantasy II, I wouldn't have played a lot of great games over that time period. So I really appreciate the fact that this game came to the U.S. And really changed how I played games for years afterwards. So what about you guys? What's the first RPG you ever played? Tell me a little bit about it. Did you beat it? Did you have a tough time with it? And you can even share your favorite RPGs with me if you want. I know for some that's a little bit of a sore subject, but that's okay. But for me, Final Fantasy 4/2, that's my RPG right there. I will replay that probably until I can't replay it anymore. Thanks for watching, everybody. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and we will do it again next week. Until then, I will see you, yes you, on the next Retro Unscripted.